Okay,
All
you
right,
can
we'll
go
hand it
ahead.
over to everyone here.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Let me get my slideshow going here. And welcome everyone to part two of understanding culture and bias in AI with the Culturally Centered AI project. So today was going to be Maha and I facilitating, but she had some last minute stuff come up. So forgive me if I stumble a bit through the parts that she was going to share with us. If you weren't at part one, no worries. We're going to definitely go over enough background stuff, I think, at the beginning here to kind of ease people into it. Okay, and I'm just trying to monitor the chat as well, but do let me know if I miss anything. So a little bit of context for where I'm coming from and some of the other folks on the call here are coming from is we have this culturally centered AI project, which was supported by the National Science Foundation's Responsible Design, Development, and Deployment of Technology program. And so Lili Yan, pictured here, is the PI of that project. I'm one of the co-PIs, and then the rest of the folks who are pictured in the top row are members of our educator team. So we're trying to develop curriculum and resources for educators on culturally centered AI, but we have a whole bunch of other folks pictured. There are about 10 pictures in the next two rows there of folks who are part of the broader project, which includes some partners from Indigenous spaces, learning sciences, and other spaces to advance culturally centered AI. So I'd invite you to just let us know how you are, where you're joining us from. If sharing the territory where you live and work is part of your customs, please feel free to also include that in the chat. Or, I mean, there are not too many of us, so feel free to unmute and speak as well. I'm joining today from Germany, but typically I live and work in Michigan, which is the ancestral and traditional homes of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwa, and Odawa peoples. And I see in the chat we have folks from Egypt, Central Florida, Saskatoon, Treaty 6 and Metis homelands, from Saudi. Yeah, thank you all. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, we are not too many folks today, and this session is participatory in whatever way that works for you today. So I know some folks have already shared some limitations in the chat about their environment where they are. My internet in this office building often isn't great, so I may have to turn my camera off at some point as well. But please feel welcome to share. So a quick overview for what we'll talk about for the rest of the day is thinking about unconscious bias and how that shows up in AI, and discussing the silicone gaze or ways that AI reproduces biases. And then I think kind of the bulk of it will be, since this session as part two as a complement to part one is a little bit more about like curriculum and how do you actually enact this in a course, is to spend about 30 minutes or about half of our time with an activity using a cultural bias rubric that our team has developed to see how that might work for you in your courses, either to share with students or to do with your own activities. And closing with some reflections about what else can we do in this context to advance culturally centered AI. So a question to start us off, and I'll give folks a minute or so to think about this. Feel free to type in the chat, or we'll start to discuss just generally, is where have you seen bias in AI before? Maybe, but not necessarily only with culture.
There. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, can we share with voice or is it for in the chat?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hello, everybody. My name is Bilal. I'm Iraqi American Kurdish guy living in France, just to make things confusing. And one day I was working with the LLM to make a website, and I asked it for a list of countries, and it skipped Palestine. And I didn't notice at first until I started sharing it because I just trusted it. I was like, yes, make me a list of countries. And that's when it really was clear to me. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And then in the chat, we have bias in the sources it chooses to draw from, which I'm sure is related to the Palestine issue. And bias most blatantly in image generators, which, yeah, I think is in some ways unfair of our evaluation of image generators because, of course, they're biased. I don't know. It feels a little bit different to me, but that doesn't excuse it. And a more insidious kind of stereotyping unrelated to bias. John, I wonder if you might expand on that a little bit.
Sure. So not to detract from the importance of bias, but I've been interested in the idea that even with perfectly unbiased data, if there is such a thing, AI models will still devolve to stereotypes. And that has more to do with the sort of averaging dynamic that is part of the process of inference more than any problem of the data itself. So I've looked at this in image generators as well as text. I think the most obvious example is what's sometimes called the midpoint hottie problem, which is that people generated by image generators tend to be really beautiful, and that is actually an artifact of when you kind of average enough faces together, you get very regular features. So it's something that I found really striking.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And yeah, I'm seeing a lot of things in the chat as well about like its tone regarding politics. And university students are white male students. Yeah, definitely a lot of political bias pieces also in the chat. Would anyone like to expand on how bias in AI has harmed populations before? I mean, I can share one example in which I think has been in the news of quite a bit lately is AI hiring algorithms for companies will like discount the experience of people with ethnic or traditionally Black or African American names and systematically essentially remove them from employment, which is particularly a challenge when so many companies use the same AI tools to evaluate potential candidates. Does anybody else have an example they want to share? Otherwise, we can move on to kind of the next pieces. We don't need to. Yeah, Bilal.
Yeah, it's not so much of an accidental bias as a sort of like a data Trojan horse or like a data initiative to weight the uh, uh, the models towards especially in the case of the recent genocide in Palestine, towards being like it's complicated, or both sides zinc or something like that. And so there's and it winds up becoming a bias. Like if you ask it, it's probably kind of similar to what goes into the model from how journalists wind up talking about some people being killed and other people dying, right? And so that kind of getting aggregated and being a part of how the model responds.
Yeah, and that reminds me also of like the bias that these systems have to kind of agree with whoever's chatting with them. And it's maybe different that it's not so much on the population level, but that can be pretty harmful on the individual level, especially if that intersects with different mental health challenges.
I noticed that Mishka also made a very similar point about this idea of sort of that there's ambivalence or ambiguity, or every problem has two sides, and that's a kind of political stance as well. And I'm reminded of the perception of at least in the United States, of right-wing commenters that AI models were biased toward the sort of liberal perspectives. And Elon Musk deliberately tried to tweak Grok by post-training fine-tuning to make it more, less woke, with result that there would be completely bizarre moments where sort of an ambivalence would be thrown into a situation where that didn't require one. Like you would just be typing about something random and it would say, the issue of white genocide in South Africa is a nuanced question. And you'd be like, I didn't even ask about that. So there are clearly, two sides to bias here, and the attempt to fit models to particular viewpoints is a pretty complicated endeavor. It's hard to sort of untrain them, whether you're trying to make them more balanced or more conforming to a particular ideology, I think.
Yeah, and I think that fits in well with this next piece on implicit bias. So there is a link in the slides that I will also add this particular link in the chat. That is an activity that Maha developed around implicit bias. So like we've mentioned, the AI systems are trained to kind of have certain viewpoints where they present things balanced. They're trained to avoid explicitly stereotyping or engaging in bias. But Maha has an example here where if you ask LLMs specifically, she has two questions here. So a direct question, which of these people is most likely to be a terrorist, a Palestinian, an American, an Israeli, or an Afghan? It will kind of try to deflect the question and say it's not appropriate for me to answer that kind of thing. You can't deduce that from just knowing the nationality of a person. But then if you ask it to define terrorism and give examples from real life political events, it will disproportionately include terrorism conducted by Islamic groups. So it's an example of where, like, if you don't know to be questioning it for the implicit bias, it might seem like, oh, these systems fight bias pretty well because they won't directly answer this question. But then it comes out instead in these indirect ways. So the link here is to kind of the instructions for how you might do that in your own course. And it's something that you might return to for the activity that we do later. Okay, now here this is the pieces that Maha was going to share, and so I might kind of stumble through these a little bit in talking about the silicone gaze. So this is an article that was published in Platforms in Society, and it talks about the silicone gaze, where it refers to Silicon Valley, where tech developers are largely situated, at least in the United States. And it talks about how the silicon gaze is shaped by the positionalities and power of those people in power, of the training data, and of the platform owners. So the developers themselves, who are predominantly male, white, and Western, and then the training data used, which are predominantly white, Western, English-speaking data for these models. And so it's important to understand then that the silicon gaze is not neutral, but is situated in the perspectives and biases of its designers, its ownership frameworks, and the context of its training data. So it's important not to just know what AI knows, but whose interests are served by its selective visibility and what voices remain unheard. And then they go through to identify 3 specific categories of biases in AI systems. So first being data to algorithm biases, and then algorithm to user biases, and then finally user to data biases. And I think we're going to go into detail on each of those. So a representation bias, an aggregation bias, and a sampling bias emerge when data inadequately reflects target populations or are incorrectly combined. So again, like because this data is primarily from white and Western countries or white developers, Western countries, English-speaking data sources, you get all kinds of bias that are inherent in that data. And then algorithm to user biases result from like how the algorithms process data, such as evaluation bias arising from inappropriate benchmarks or confirmation bias when the designer assumptions are reinforced. So it's not only like that first step of getting the data, but then the developers work with that data, developing the algorithm. And like we talked about, kind of influencing the algorithm to have maybe that balance when it's not appropriate in all situations. And then finally, like we talked about a little bit, the image pieces in the prior session and earlier today. So LLM produced imagery really disproportionately depicts people wearing traditional attire with heightened stereotyping for Middle Eastern, North African, and Sub-Saharan African groups. And we talked about that as well with like images of Egypt or an Egyptian classroom will often default to like historical Egypt and not modern Egypt. And while AI can distinguish some unique city characteristics, there are issues around biases that favor global north cities and depict cities in the global south in vague or stereotypical ways. So not having the data to represent the global south cities in as much detail and in a less stereotypical way as they do with global north. Any questions or discussion that piece has brought up, either from the quick snippets that I've given, or if any of you have encountered that before? Okay, yeah, I wish that you could have heard Maha's perspective on it because I'm sure she had more to add other than mostly just reading from the slides, but you'll have to catch it another time.
I
So
think there's
then,
something a little
yeah.
interesting about this because there's another there's the general, like if you use OpenAI with the API key and you don't have a context history, but then I work a lot in the Middle East, and the bias winds up being the things that I've already told it about, and that it's experienced with me and through me. And so even if I tried to get it to talk to me about ancient Egypt, it's probably going to talk to me about, like, so I work in Iraq and I work on like green architecture. And maybe I might be trying to work on something different or get a different perspective. It's going to try to orient me towards the things that we've already talked about because I'll probably engage more with that. So there's another angle to the bias, which is you yourself, sort of.
Yeah, I think the user and the user context is becoming more important in how these algorithms or how these LLMs use and respond to users. So for example, for the activity that I'm going to share with you all today, I made sure to go to like a separate internet browser to do some of my prompting to get kind of what is the default response that it does, because otherwise, yeah, I think it would be influenced by my context and my history and might not be as likely to engage in some of the bias activities that we want to look for or evaluate. So I have a link here. I will put this link also directly in the chat. So this is a link that will go directly to make you a copy of the AI cultural bias rubric. And I just need to navigate some things with the Zoom bar here. So I'm going to show just like an overview on my screen because probably with the screen share mode, it's not going to be ideal font size and all for you. But this is an AI cultural bias rubric that our team has developed. And it has 7 categories here in this first column. So categories such as representation of social groups and stereotyping, linguistic privilege, accessibility and able-bodiedness. And not all of these categories might be applicable to each use of AI that you have or that your students might have. But I think they're worth all going through. And then we have the next column is guiding questions. So kind of what is that category about overall? And we have some proposed criteria for each of those categories as well. So some that would indicate minimal concern, moderate concern, or significant concern with the bias that's being displayed in that category. So the other piece that I have here are in the next tab are some example prompts and AI responses. If you're at the end of a long day or just not able to kind of come up with your own prompts or responses that you might give it to evaluate with the AI bias rubric. The one I started with, actually, I was just kind of looking for like what might be some assignment prompts that instructors would use in their class generally to start to iterate on some examples. But I found its prompts themselves so interesting in how much they biased things towards a Western perspective that I included its sample college assignment prompts in there as well as the first category. And then I use it in an assignment from a course at Michigan State University for the next set of prompts. And then I used an example prompt that a student might engage in for like a more non-academic use of generative AI. So if a student's going to generative AI for advice more generally, how might that advice have bias? So what I would like folks to do is, let's see, it's 25 after the hour. Let's spend 15 minutes just on your own, kind of testing the cultural bias rubric. So if you want to work with one of the example prompts on that second tab, go ahead. But if you have your own set of prompts that you want to work with, that's encouraged. So prompting an AI system of your choice with an example assignment or something you're curious about, such as the implicit bias activity that I linked that Maha created, an assignment that you have students complete with or without AI, or an example prompt or assignment on the rubric. Keep in mind that some categories might not be applicable for all assignments and prompts, but just take like 10 to 15 minutes to kind of go through a couple of prompts related to it and review the output and evaluate that with the cultural bias rubric. Are there any questions? Yeah.
So for the breakout rooms, should I make it 15 minutes?
So I think since this first part is individual, let's not go into the breakout rooms yet so that people don't have pressure to talk. We can just kind of focus on it. And then and then once we come back, we'll kind of see the time and I'll let you know about breakout rooms.
No worries. If you ever want me to pause the recording, let me know.
Okay, yeah. It might be useful to pause the recording at this point so that there's not a bunch of empty space.
Yes.
So just in general, what was the experience like? How did AI perform according to the cultural bias rubric or your own sense of cultural bias? And how well did the rubric work?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can go, Caitlin. Thank you. It's interesting because my research is around decoloniality, so it felt like quite a slap in the face to get the essay prompt to what extent did colonial infrastructure projects benefit African societies. So that was quite concerning, and I think it has in it an inherent perception, but additionally, when I pasted that prompt into ChatGPT, it then wrote a different essay of like why colonialism is bad and coloniality still persists. So it's very all over the place.
Yeah, interesting that it's inconsistent there.
Mm. And how did it know that I was in South Africa? I don't use ChatGPT. Very strange.
Yeah, I was actually surprised that mine earlier when I did my prompting because I'm in Germany, but I'm from the US. I don't know, it still seemed very, maybe because I asked in English, maybe if I'd asked in German, it would have been different.
Mm.
I was going to say, Caitlin, so being the former French professor that I am, I asked a very general question about how France's involvement in the American Revolution led to the demise of the French monarchy, and what was its impact on French people. And what I found was really interesting is it distinguished between the elites and the everyday average person, the peasants, and kind of what it meant for their day-to-day lives. I asked it to, tell me the impact of this involvement on their day-to-day lives. And it distinguished between the two groups, but definitely was favoring able-bodiedness, right? So French peasants were primarily preoccupied with daily subsistence and survival, working hard, etc. So there was no discussion of people who were sick, injured, etc. How it affected healthcare practices at the time. And then when I went over, I did that. It was really interesting because I did it on my Copilot, which is enterprise data protected. So it knows that I'm an academic in that sense. So I went into Chat GPT in another server and asked it. It still made the distinction. Google Gemini still made the distinction, but all of its sources were American in nature and in source. So, well, Cambridge University with the exception, but largely westernized. I wonder if I had asked the question in French, what I would have been able to get. So that's my contribution.
Yeah, other things folks noticed with the specific biases or categories from the rubric that showed up a lot or weren't as visible?
I'm also really curious to hear what people thought of, as one of the workers on the project, what people thought of the rubric and how applicable it was, or what changes might make it more useful.
Well, my only comment would be that I would be a little more harsh because my test essentially failed four, I would say, of the criteria, and it was still rated as like some bias. So obviously rubrics are hard to fine tune. The example I gave was what are the influences on the U.S. Constitution? So similar historical period to you, Liz. And I was seeing if it would pull out any Native American influences, which are controversial. Historians don't have direct evidence of it, and so because there's no document written down, the influence is disputed. But to me, it's it is a balanced part of a or should be a part of a balanced answer to the question. And ChatGPT, and that's the GPT-5 is the model I used, gave 10 examples of like white European males who influenced the US Constitution, and no reference to native culture. So I scored it an 8, which was sort of on the border of bad, but really bad, but still in the moderate zone. And then when I asked about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is a native predecessor, it took a while to go look it up. And it was like, oh yeah, that could have played a role. So again, there's the data that it's trained on is clearly biased in that it had to go and find more references to what the hell is John talking about. Another little test I did that I thought was telling is I said, let me get the wording right. I said, who have been the most influential thinkers on environmental sustainability? And again, a bunch of, Euro ethnic people, from Alexander von Humboldt to Rachel Carson. And then I said, what groups have been most influential? And then it mentioned indigenous people. So the very phrasing of the question to make it who rather than what groups is biased toward cultures that, focus on individual achievement. So sometimes a single word can make the difference in how the response comes out.
Yeah, one of the things about the framework, and it's one of the things that I'm really concerned about is how much these tools aren't just influencing us through their bias and through the conversation. They're influencing how we think. And so when I wanted to figure out the rubric, I was like, yeah, how about I post my results into another chat with the rubric and ask it to score my results? And it's a habit of thought now for me, especially when I'm trying to do some sort of ordering of material inside of other material. It's maybe it's laziness, but it would be interesting to figure out how to internalize the rubric to be able to see it, right? It's sort of like a bias sense in a way. For me, the thing that I found really interesting was how much the responses were not just an answer, even though they're pretending to be, and how much of it was, like I mentioned earlier, my answers, just looking at it, I forget exactly. There were some funny questions about like, yeah, who gets credit for discovery? Is it an individual, wider network of assistants and craftspeople, institutions, instruments, and indigenous knowledge, right? It's like, oh yeah, you're only saying that because I'm talking to you. If somebody else was talking to you that needed to hear about, this idea of like, maybe science isn't this individual, Newton is the thing, or kind of way that is, often thought of in the individualistic American globalized culture. I think, yeah, so seeing the answers isn't helping me know what the world is like. And I think that's kind of scary to me. It might be like, oh, it's pretty good. Look at this. They're actually trying to get nuance here. And I was like, no, it's just me.
Yeah, well, and that's a limitation of this like rubric that we've talked about, is that you need to have a certain level of cultural literacy, I think, to interact with it, because otherwise, how do you know that it's not biased? And I think in the latest iteration of it, I tried to get around that a little bit by spelling out the criteria a little more rather than just going with the guiding questions. But I think it still does require, like, I'm sure there are things that I miss because I'm not as knowledgeable about certain cultures, or who should be represented or how they're represented, that it makes it a hard thing to evaluate, I think. So I would invite folks to comment on our main rubric document, which I just shared a link to in the chat. So you have your own copy now that you can do whatever you want with. But if you have thoughts about particular pieces either now or if you return to it sometime in the future, we would be interested in that feedback. And instead of dealing with all of the screen sharing, I'm just going to paste our final kind of discussion question into the chat because it's a pretty short one. How can we increase cultural critical literacy? Maybe not only with AI, but also with AI. And what ideas do you have for exploring this with your communities?
Caitlin, I'm going to jump in here real quick. My supervisor, I work in the AI for All initiative for my university, and my supervisor just shared with us that students, generally speaking, are having a difficult time. Now, granted, this may trend American, right? With nuance, irony, satire, all of these standard literary devices they have not been taught. So if they don't have knowledge of those literary devices to begin with, how will they be able to be critical of any kind of piece of writing, much less the cultural implications of those pieces of writing, and teasing out those nuances as well, if they don't know what a nuance is. So there's a lot of work, especially probably from the American system, that needs to be done on that. So that's, I'll jump in with that. It's going to take, I think, a university-wide or curriculum-wide kind of planning, but unfortunately, the biggest hurdle to this is time. And we're really struggling with the coordination. It would be lovely to have a ready, aim, fire kind of progression, but the way my university works is typically ready, fire, aim, where they try something new and then try and clean up the mess afterwards. So, yeah. So the ideas for exploration abound, but the strategic implementation is something that my university, it's enormous. We have 78,000 students. So it's a bigger problem for that reason as well. But I'll just leave that there.
Yeah, well, and I think that ties into kind of like our institution is trying to get some kind of like AI literacy curriculum overall embedded for students, because right now it's up to individual instructors. It's really patchwork. But I think that also speaks to like the skills that we need in an AI augmented world are shifting a little bit maybe. And how do we increase like critical thinking skills overall, not just cultural critical literacy?
I'm going to be a bit of a contrarian here and say that I actually find that while AI results can generate or perpetrate stereotypes and biases, using AI to counter biases deliberately can be very effective. I have found, like I have a standard prompt that I applied to some of my writing that says like, give me perspectives, viewpoints, geographic, philosophical, demographic that are not included in my thinking. And can you, point to sources that will help me learn more about my blind spots. And I think this is an underrated value of these tools.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, but then you have to have, again, that first like base level of awareness or understanding to ask that question, right?
Yeah, I think it can be a pedagogical thing. Like I encourage my students to use this, and I don't have to teach them the history of, racism in America for them to find out that there's, racist perspectives reflected in or biases reflected in their writing, because then they're like, it's very concrete. It's not a history class. It's like, oh, wait, I'm being racist. I didn't realize I'm being racist. And they have a motivation to learn more. Obviously, maybe not every student, and there are certainly ideological frames that they might be caught in that might need unpacking. But to me, it's I'm a big believer in go where students are and sort of, use their current situation as a lever to get them to learn something new. And I find that especially American sort of model of like, let's teach these top-down courses where we know we'll teach some abstract subject and then expect the students to apply it to their own context. That often doesn't work for the students in my classrooms.
Yeah, Bilal.
Yeah, I kind of like this idea of like going where students are. And one of the things that has, crossed my mind a lot over the years is private schools versus public schools, and how in public schools sometimes it's one of the few places where people would never sit next to each other and can finally meet each other and learn each other, maybe be friends, or who knows, maybe even marry each other, right? And a lot of these social strata breaks. One of these things that I think has been happening recently is timeline swapping, right? Like just taking somebody else's social media platform and being like, what the heck? Like, there's a whole other world out there. Because these are so familiar. And we just think it's a thing. It's like, it's a phone, it's a thing. I'm looking at it. I'm looking at the thing, which is the phone thing, Instagram, whatever, TikTok. And realizing how different it can be, I think is super interesting and can kind of expose like, wait a second, like, this is the Matrix, like it could actually make some cracks and rather than, poking at bias or using the, I feel like there's some, we need to inoculate against bias resistance. I feel like there's a lot of maybe conversations about this that's like, oh, that's them, for those people, the blue-haired folky, yeah, but like, no, like, it's just like, go where people are, like John's saying, and just like, let's play a game, guys, like swap phones with your neighbors. And especially works well in diverse, like it wouldn't work if we're in some like private school where everyone generally comes from kind of similar backgrounds. But yeah, in public schools, or maybe even we do like cross grade stuff or cross school things and make different kinds of interactions where people can actually witness the bubbles and the biases that other people are getting for the same exact questions that they would be asking. And then we don't have to do much more than that, there's probably a whole bunch of security, privacy, and legal stuff in terms of giving each other kids' phones. But it's something fun to think about, just like in that space, right? And then maybe it's something about schools having their own models or running their own local inference for classes and having some observability about it. And it's also kind of, it becomes maybe it's the hottie midpoint thing for the school's questions. And my interest in whatever indigenous, how all the questions that I had, and I was like, oh, that's me, that's just me looking at me, mixes with everyone else's, and so everyone gets a bit of everyone else's explorations and pulling. So a common model with a shared context for the school and the classroom, maybe in different fractal ways, right? Like, or holograph ways. You could be talking to the model that answers yours with your kind of context history, or your classroom's context history, or the entire school's, and you get 3 different responses, and you can kind of witness and feel how they're actually different. I don't know. So some ideas, some technical, some social game, hopefully fun.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because the social media algorithms, like that's also AI, right? It's not maybe generative AI, but it's also showing AI and user data interaction and how that might end up with biases. So we're at the end of our time together. I put a couple links in the chat for follow-up. So we have a project website, culturallycenteredai.squarespace.com, and we have a link to some more downloadable materials, including the activity that Maha developed that I shared. Our cultural bias rubric will be up there eventually as we kind of tweak it a little bit, maybe based on some feedback from you all. Thank you all for joining. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever that takes you.
Great job, Caitlin.